We're good.
So yay, welcome, Paul.
Thank you very
Uh,
much.
this is Irene Weiser, and I am here to very excited to welcome Paul to our TCOG CCA work group. Paul and I have been in touch by phone for probably the better part of 4 years, Paul, off and on.
Yeah, something like that.
And for those that don't know much about Paul, just very briefly introduce him the way I think of him, which is as the father of CCA. Many years ago, he started, along with his partner, Julia Peters, started community choice aggregation. At that point, he now calls it version 1.0. And looking at 1.0 and seeing what he saw were the good bits and the bad bits, or the less good bits, he revised it and came up with CCA 2.0, which is at this point predominantly what our work group has been hearing about, is the kinds of programs that are in place in New York State that are looking towards offering green recs for green options for people to buy into at a somewhat escalated price. And again, Paul has looked at the strengths and weaknesses of the kinds of ways that CCA 2.0 is happening, not only in New York State, but other places around the country. And has realized that there's much more that can be done and needs to be done to really transform our energy systems in the way that we need to rapidly, and also to give much more local control and bring social equity to the vision in a much more holistic way. And so before I overstep and start saying things that are wrong about CCA 3.0, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, but I'm very enthusiastic and excited that he's here and that all of you are here to hear from him.
Thank you so much. I will try to share my screen now.
Here we go.
Okay, good. Crazy number of slides to show you today. So I'll just get going, try to get into it. It's a big subject. The framework I like to start out with is the United Nations, just because there's discussions about climate change have often implicitly different, if you want to call it, emergency colors. There's sort of the yellow version of climate change, there's the red version. One says that we have 30 years to choose something, the other one says we should have done it yesterday. I like the United Nations calling for energy transformation by 2030. This is broadly across sectors and requires leadership. So just the idea of leadership, often climate discussions are focused on compliance, the idea that we have a certain amount of emissions that we have to get rid of, like everyone else, that we should do our part. But leadership is really different because it has to do with acting before the others in order to establish a parallel process. And that's why I really focus with communities that have got the climate emergency. Move on to the details. So as far as experience of the expansion of CCA, it's now half the United States that's under CCA laws in terms of the energy market, because the states in green here are by far the largest energy users other than Florida and Texas. So it's quite widespread across the country, but less understood maybe it's just the chronology of how it developed. We were involved, I was involved from the beginning, writing the original Massachusetts law, and then as Irene mentioned, moved to California and focused on developing what we call 2.0. I've also been involved a lot in New York since 2014. I was involved with NYSERDA and with the New York State Clean Energy Advisory Council CCA working subgroup that was focused on how to make CCA more effective in New York for developing localization and so on, but then developed most recently what we call the CCA 3.0 model with a bunch of municipalities on the eastern seaboard, including Saratoga Springs, New York. So now we're working with municipalities. These are the clients we've had over the major clients we've had over the years in developing local energy programs. Cambridge, Mass, most recently, with Northampton, Mass, and other Massachusetts towns. So the original kind of paradigm for CCA was to enable communities to buy greener power at a discount. It was really very simple, and part of the idea was to make it simple so that it's more likely to be implemented. And the simplicity of it ended up sort of haunting us in a sense, because while it was popular for saving people money, small consumers on their bills, they moved to an outsourced administrator model, in which tended toward a more kind of legalistic or financial view of greening instead of a physical one. And so they developed this trend toward the purchase of renewable energy certificates rather than building renewables. And not only that, because the programs were outsourced, they never really evolved. The city councils and mayors working on them never really developed literacy. They depended on their contractors to educate them about their options, and their contractors specialized just in essentially transactions, not in development. And so they just never really evolved. And the growth of CCA at first, as a result of all this, was quite slow. The business model was centered on just the sale of retail power, going out and negotiating a better deal from the ESCO supplier. Their focus of their knowledge was therefore basically regulatory, or the relationship with an energy retailer, which is an energy trader. And they outsourced everything with almost virtually no staff. They didn't budget staff, and that was part of the appeal of starting the programs, is they didn't have to put up funding for the programs. But the result was that overdependence on the broker, or administrator, which are small businesses, to negotiate with large energy retailers, was they really didn't achieve any carbon benefits to speak of. And so about 20 years ago, we created 2.0. And the idea was to shift from buying greener power with a discount to building greener local power at rate parity. And this was in a California law adopted in 2002, and it had a different program structure. The first principle of the program structure is to stop outsourcing administration of the programs. That required that municipalities fund their own launches, and then use the program revenues in CCAs to pay their staffing costs. They bypassed the middlemen, the brokers and the energy retailers, negotiating directly with suppliers and developers. And they funded themselves. They built up their staff incrementally based on the level of program revenue. So they could start out on a very small amount of funding and then build up staff as they went along, as they built up the amount of participation. And many of these CCAs didn't realize when they took over their energy supply that the CCA revenues exceeded their discretionary budgets of their city budgets. It's a lot of money that's involved in, and it can fund those programs. The results were really astonishing. We got moved from a cookie cutter business model where renewable energy certificates are being remarketed to customers to this incredible range of programs that you see here, from battery storage incentives, demand response programs, electric vehicle rates, electric bus programs, electric vehicle incentives, electric vehicle load shifting, energy efficiency programs, feed-in tariffs, building electrification, low income, solar incentives. And the list is really long here. You have microgrids, school programs, dividend programs, time of use rates, integration of codes into the program, solar plus storage program, workforce training, job placement. Right? This incredible diversity resulted from that shift from an outsourced to an insourced model, and led to a great deal of innovation. As today, this is fairly recent. Actually, this is last November, but it's ongoing microgrid out in a small town in Northern California at their airport. There are community-wide solar plus storage initiatives. There are frame agreements and MOUs with companies to systematically look at energy transitions at the community level. And so you have this really exciting kind of explosion in the not just the number of CCAs, but the impact. So this is just from the UCLA Luskin Center study last December. This is a map of all of the yellow dots are all of the US cities that have 100% renewable energy today. The blue ones have set goals. They've committed to a date to become 100% renewable. The yellow ones have 100% renewable. So 67 out of 72 cities in the United States are CCA 2.0 programs. It's an important fact. Within the state, the replication also was accelerated. It was by the excitement of the opportunity. So you have virtually the entire coast of California is today a CCA. As you can see, those colored jurisdictions. And they have built billions of dollars of new local renewables in the past 3 years. And they have 10 million customers just in California. So there's 20 million customers outside of California, 10 million inside of California, and they're forecasted by the utilities to nearly triple. Virtually the whole state will be under CCAs by 2022, according to the utility forecast to the state regulator. And then in the meantime, whereas, in the early years, there was almost no CCA, and even in Massachusetts where it started, in the last 10 years, there's been this great proliferation of CCA around the country. And so have 30 million Americans, 1,500 cities that are CCAs today. But many of them are using 1.0 methods, expecting they're going to get 2.0 results, right? They think that they can go out to a small broker or program administrator and just hire them, and they'll do what California did. They're still using renewable energy certificates. They're still using, depending on solar export tariffs, incentives, and other incremental policies that are really decades old that were designed for utilities to meet really incremental goals set by the states in the 1990s, not an emergency, not an energy transformation, not changing the whole system in a fairly short period of time to decarbonize that system. And so you have this kind of in a way, a kind of split in the discourse around CCA and climate action. You have the incrementalist paradigm that says, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But then you have the emergency paradigm that says, don't let gestures be the enemy of the real. You want change to be real. You have to make it real. It's not going to automatically be real. And so there's this tendency, with activism that we're often up against to, there's been all this inactivity and the feeling like we should just do something because we're not doing anything. Let's do something. So you kind of wait too long and then hurry up and don't really do the due diligence to make it really effective. And sometimes that easiest way of doing things is not the right way. It really is, in our view, it's the approach to climate action that stifles the results, not technology, not even really policy goals. We can't expect the same results or different results using the same methods. And if we've got to change the approach. And so that's really where we're coming from with this program. Looking at the framework for all these policies I'm talking about all come from the same school of economics, namely neoliberal school of economics. And outsourcing is very much a central part of that school of economics, that you deregulate, that you minimize the role of government, that you pursue market-based solutions, that you use incentive mechanisms, and that you use tax breaks. But the result of those is that you end up with markets defined by bottom feeders, by renewable energy certificates that have near fraudulent representation with almost no ecological benefits. And most people that think they're 100% renewable are really not. In fact, you have an overdependence on contractors that by the municipalities that deprives them of literacy and understanding, knowledge, and know-how about what they're doing. The de-skilling of those agencies makes them essentially incompetent and incapable of implementing programs. And then you have huge markups on so-called soft costs on systems that are based on incentives. Incentives basically end up doubling the cost of systems so that developers can pocket the soft costs. So half the cost of photovoltaic systems put in under incentive regimes today in the United States are soft costs. They aren't paying for the solar. They're paying for essentially customer acquisition, marketing cost of the companies. And then you have absentee investors dominating the investment in these technologies. And that means that the benefits are extracted by absentee investors. These are so-called tax appetite investors that are avoiding federal taxes by investing in renewables under federal law. And so you end up with this kind of dilution of all the favorite words of the public. From renewable has been diluted. It doesn't really mean anything. It means a credit. Community used to mean something. It doesn't really mean that anymore today. That much community solar is essentially tax avoidance capital in which all the benefits are extracted from the local in the name of the community. And so where does this all lead? It leads to a race to the bottom, that renewable becomes a legal transaction, not a physical change. Community becomes an abstraction. Equity becomes meaningless. And in the process, the reason for people to participate in climate action is diluted to zero. So low and fixed income people are excluded. Renters are excluded. Homeowners with a non optimal credit score are excluded. Small and medium-sized businesses are excluded. And so really the issue it keeps coming down to is the need for capacity to engage the whole community to participate in a program. I like to use the term from curbside recycling because it's really more voluntary than it's the consumption of a product. You know, why is it that you separate your paper from your plastic? Because the community is doing it and they ask you to do it. They're not paying you to do it. Some companies, some cities require that you do it. But that side of the public, which is more voluntary, rather than just buying a product, the green consumption versus green citizenship, these are different psychological states. And the outsourcing creates a strictly commercial environment in which a small company that has no leverage to engage the community has to therefore make up for the inability to leverage engagement through other means. And so you end up with an arrangement in which the Public Service Commission, the state regulator, has to set up a system like CDG, Community Distributed Generation, to facilitate a transaction simply because the administrator of the program doesn't have the leverage to engage that customer. So this whole approach is really what I'm trying to get at in the presentation. It's really contrary to the necessary activities of climate action. Municipalities are the natural stewards of climate mobilization. They're empowered to ensure safety and security. They're known to everyone. Whether they're loved is another question, but they're at least known. Program administrators are small businesses that are not known to anyone. And even new CCA programs that are run as NGOs, unknown to anyone. So that's a very important part of engagement, is being known, even if you're not liked being known. They are most proximate and geographically accessible. They're accountable. We have public meetings. The CCAs that are run by municipalities have monthly meetings. And they provide similar services today: water and sewer, waste management, economic development. They have subscription services. They engage the community in volunteerism. So the municipality is it. They built, in the last 2 centuries, we would not have sewer systems without municipalities. We would not have bridges without them. Over time, other entities took over the building of these infrastructures, but not when they were first created. That it's the role of the municipality to do new things that are needed for public safety and well-being. It's a natural role for municipalities to address climate mobilization. And they have planning authorities. They own public rights of way. They are themselves major energy users. They have critical energy needs. They hold franchises with utilities. They have special access to utility data and other data sets about the community that are essential in planning climate mobilization. And so outsourcing really gives the wrong job to the wrong people, that consultants don't have the infrastructure capacity to engage the community. They don't have existing billing systems to every address that can help them to charge and credit customers that participate. They have existing communication platforms that are zero-cost communication platforms that are highly effective compared to anything a small business can come up with. And so it's by giving the role to the wrong people, to an outside contractor, it makes them and their programs entirely dependent on the Public Service Commission to prop them up, and specifically to force the utilities to prop them up. And so it places the whole program into this utility approval track, which is really a dead end because they don't want to do it. And they might do it in a limited way if they're forced to, but in the long run, it's a losing strategy. Alongside of outsourcing are some other losing strategies, from renewable energy certificates, which have been severely abused because the purchase of the certificate does not alter the actual power source content. It does not actually physically reduce any carbon emissions for those who buy the certificates. The market impacts of renewable energy certificates, or RECs, are essentially theoretical, based on belief in the market. It's a kind of really economic ideology. But in some ways, the same arguments apply to centralized grid renewables that require transmission, in the sense that transmission lines require fossil fuel backup for renewables, and the backup is a very significant volume. It's not a small amount of backup. Spinning reserves and filling grid capacity means that building a centralized renewable solution, while valuable, is not a complete solution carbon-wise, because it's always sort of backfilling the renewables with more fossil fuels. So the only real pathway that is credible is distributed energy resource development, or DERs. And from these are, because they're inside the substation service area, they don't require balancing capacity. Those that are behind from the grid, and therefore fossil resources that are burning to provide that balancing. But also, to the extent that they don't net meter, they have no carbon emissions associated with them, other than the manufacture of the panels and so on, which is a very small volume by comparison. And net metered solar, however, presents another problem in terms of a carbon solution, because net energy metering involves, like renewable energy certificates, no alteration of the actual demand for grid energy from houses that have solar on them. Essentially, they're generating power onto the grid, not onto themselves, and they're consuming power from the grid unchanged by the presence of that solar panel. So there's no actual physical reduction in combustion from that supply under a net metering arrangement. So in addition to the congestion on the distribution system that exporting process creates, these are all factors that led us to a different model for climate mobilization, which involves a more complex integration of resources to avoid exporting and to avoid the need for balancing capacity on the grid. So this is just a diagram showing you've got the grid. Instead of having a two-way flow between the building and the grid, it's just a one-way flow that's been reduced, because the power on site, whether it's a solar panel or an electric vehicle that's storing solar panel power, or hot water systems that are renewable, or appliance automation, those all are essentially removing demand from the grid, and therefore removing the need for generated power, from spinning reserves, from balancing capacity, all the things I was just talking, new transmission lines, all the things I was just talking about. It's a kind of shrinking of the load from the bottom up. I'll repeat that community distributed generation, as a sort of subset of the outsourcing idea, is not a climate mobilization pathway. It has, first of all, its pilot status in New York State is under severe funding caps that are even more strict than net metering. So it's in a tiny box, and its ability to get out of that box is highly speculative. It's not replicable as far as a leadership model for climate action, because this kind of structure is not allowed in other states, and it's unlikely to be approved. The reason it's unlikely to be approved and to go beyond pilot stage in New York, in our view, is that enrolling customers on an opt-out basis, while that is how it works for aggregations on an ongoing energy procurement basis, but to enroll people on an opt-out basis in a debt, an obligation to pay a debt, is, in our view, without an active affirmative choice, is legally dubious and even ethically dubious. There are just a lot of people that don't want to participate that are going to be forced into an obligation under that arrangement. We think it's going to get into a lot of trouble, and we wouldn't pursue that approach. And we don't think it's necessary. Moreover, we think it's essentially a band-aid measure on the fact that these programs are outsourced and that the companies that are performing there are unable to engage their communities. So CDG is really an outsourced alternative to effective customer engagement. Those administrators don't have the resources to engage customers, and CDG was created to fill that capacity gap. But we need, for climate mobilization, we need much more engagement of customers, not less engagement and voluntary customer investment. We feel that's a categorical value that needs to be put up front of these programs. So insourcing is what made 2.0 what it is today. But more was still needed. I'm not trying to present 2.0 as a complete model, but as a movement in that direction, not back toward an outsourced model that we're seeing happening now. The 2.0 model shifted from a retail supply focus centered around the broker or the administrator to an agency-centric approach where the CCA, a regional CCA agency, stands between the customer and wholesale supply. That is a more direct link between the CCA agency and the actual generators of energy, actual developers, not middlemen. And the mission of the 2.0 agency is to develop basically centralized but local renewables. So the focus was how to get local solar farms, local wind farms, local geothermal farms built by substituting new agreements with developers for grid power. The downside of it, the limitation of 2.0 in California, with all of its success, with which I'm very proud, is that it was a heavy lift. It created all of the responsibility within a new startup agency that had to do everything. And it was going to go out and buy power and deal with the regulator, but it was also going to go out and sign up developers to build projects that had to provide all of its own credit and collateral. It was doing all the investing. It was taking its role as a steward of everyone's collective buying power and deciding to make certain investments here and there. And that involved some risk and responsibility that in some ways was also not that replicable. I mean, it is replicable in some places, but not others. So we're looking for a model that works for communities that maybe are a little risk averse and nervous about that kind of responsibility, but do want to implement significant change. And so we wanted to kind of take it to a new model that didn't depend so much on kind of this sort of central role of one new agency that has to do everything while everyone else is kind of passive. The customers are passive. They're not really doing anything. They're not making investments. Municipalities within them are not even really playing a role. They're just treated as customers. Local companies aren't really being engaged. It tends to stay in a big business mode. The larger developers are building the systems, somewhat tendency to a less local kind of approach to development. But also looking at CCA 2.0 as a climate platform, part of the problem is that it's just dealing with one fraction of the addressable carbon coming from the community. That's so-called plug loads, electricity and buildings. And that's a big piece of it. It's arguably the largest piece, depending on where you live. But transportation is about as big, heating and hot water, comparable, and then municipal waste. So looking at the all addressable carbon sources, a climate pathway has to address all of these, right? It has to include all of these. So we came out the last few years, as I mentioned, with Saratoga Springs and a dozen other cities, Northampton out here, with 3-point CCA 3.0. And the paradigm here, we're shifting from 1.0 was buy green power at a discount, 2.0 is build green power at parity, 3.0 is climate mobilization. It's a step up. And the idea here, this is the title of the report, the cover page of the report, which is available on our website if you want to read it. But the idea is to create social equity through universal shares and cooperatives. That's an engagement mechanism for customers to augment voluntary investment by customers, not to enroll them without their knowledge, but to use share systems and cooperative systems to engage all customers in technologies that avoid energy use. And those are essentially these non-exporting systems I'm talking about, to avoid the purchase of grid power, to avoid the purchase of pipeline gas, and to avoid purchase of pumped gas and diesel. So I'll explain sort of how that works. So the human problem really is the core to climate mobilization. It's not a technology problem. It's not an economic problem. It's a human problem. The conventional approaches today that we have out there for solar, whether it's green power or for solar power, whether they're state programs, deregulated, or utility programs, they all exclude the majority. And that's really the core problem that we have, that redlining is the normal MO of the energy industry. They're selling to the affluent. They're selling to big business in the affluent. There are obviously exceptions, but those exceptions are all stuck in that pilot project mode of CDG. They never go beyond that. And in order to, if you do the carbon math and look at, getting, as the UN said, getting energy transformation by 2030, if you actually want to do that, if you want to lead that effort, you've got to engage all these people. The vast majority of users of energy, if you include all the addressable causes, cars, heating, air conditioning, hot water, and building energy, most of them are low-income and small, medium-sized businesses. They're not rich, and they're not, obviously not large corporations. So the model has to be able to effectively engage all of these people that are currently being redlined. Otherwise, we're really just pretending. And that's what we have been doing effectively. So just to compare them at a high level, CCA 1.0 is one-dimensional. It serves plug loads. It's just a sale of energy to plug loads with mitigation by certificates. 2.0 is sort of two-dimensional. It serves only plug loads, but it involves so-called additionality, which is building new solar farms, new wind farms, adding new renewable resources onto the grid. The 3.0 model uses something we call subtractionality, which is the idea of subtracting demand from the grid, from the bottom up. And it does that through an engagement of all customers in this new, much more forward manner through municipalities, and involving all energy, not just plug loads, but all users of energy. So under this model, the municipalities will partner with a CCA, or they'll partner with each other, depending on exactly how they want to structure it and the location, to share the roles in this process in a more even basis, so there's less risk and less cost for each of the parties. But the focus of their program, rather than being for themselves to make these investments and themselves to do everything and to own everything, is to facilitate local customer voluntary investment. And so it's changing that whole model from a centralized agency model to a more decentralized community-based model, in which the roles of the CCA and the roles of the municipality are kind of divided in a way that makes it possible to implement a degrowth strategy of the pipeline and the grid for communities, so that those carbon emissions are physical, not legal. And so here, another illustration here, which I think I'll just skip over for time, but it's about avoiding grid and avoiding fuel combustion. The 3.0 supply chain focus shifts from the CCA agency doing everything to the municipality assisting customers and with the development of distributed energy resources, while the CCA program is sort of energy industry facing, dealing with the supply contracts and dealing with the regulatory compliance, and then facilitating the substitution of customer-owned renewables into the supply. So this is a sort of a technological representation of the 3.0 program, because it means moving much of the generation, instead of having large wind farms and big solar farms out in the countryside or on the grid. We're talking about urban redevelopment with load avoiding facilities. In other words, different kinds of microgrids that integrate all energy as forms of flexible capacity. So currently what you have on solar plus storage programs are being implemented pretty widely, particularly in California, but they mostly rely on lithium-ion batteries, and there are limits with those. There are also ecological impacts with those. And so the microgrids that we're developing involve many different kinds of storage instead of one. So it's looking at the heating systems as a form of flexible storage. We're looking at electric vehicles as flexible storage. We're looking at appliance automation as another form of flexible storage. And then finally, municipal post-consumer waste-based hydrogen as a supplemental energy storage source on these microgrids. So you can see how that, as a result, includes all the addressable sources of carbon for a community, right? The automobiles, the heating systems, the plug loads, municipal waste, all four. So as far as the technological design of these systems that are in urban environments on buildings, these are non-exporting systems rather than what you have today, which are net metered systems that export back onto the grid while still consuming grid power. The return on investment from these systems is based on avoided grid electricity, avoided gas pipeline, and avoided gasoline and diesel consumption. So it's looking to enroll customers more actively in electric vehicles and electric vehicle sharing, in renewable on-site heat systems and on-site heat systems sharing, and in microgrids. So there's a lot of physical sharing involved in this approach, where vehicles and heating systems are providing an energy storage function on microgrids so that they don't depend so much on the grid to support them. So you're just going up to a high level again. You've got on the center of this image here, the CCA removing carbon in a very dilutive way initially, but that's growing with the newly built renewable grid power that you have in California. And then when you start subtracting load, that impact carbon-wise is exponentially larger. So you're getting into a much more profound scenario that you can call climate mobilization credibly. But you're also gaining so-called climate resilience. And it's quite significantly the net metered systems, when the grids fail, they shut off. And an integrated microgrid stays on. The carbon levels are much more reduced with a microgrid system, and the economics as far as savings are far greater, and the economic performance of these systems is far more cost effective because you're avoiding gasoline and natural gas consumption, which are much more expensive than electricity. So those sort of price points and price thresholds are far superior. It's an investment-centric, a voluntary customer investment-centric model, which in terms of the specific commercial approach is focused on initially on municipal governments themselves. So we're going to municipalities and saying, okay, you need more resilient systems for the next hurricane, for the next storm, and you've got these municipal accounts for you're a major energy user. Most towns in America consume at least 5% of the energy of the whole community is the municipality itself. That's for lighting and buildings and so on. Some towns that goes up to 10%, depends on the place. But that's a significant place to start as far as being able to launch a local initiative to build resilience hubs. So we're working with the city of Cambridge they're very focused on preparing for storms right now. So, and that's what we're doing. We're saying the municipal buildings are a commercialization platform for a 3.0 program in your community, because you don't have to just launch 3.0 right away. You start out by building, basically hardening your municipal facilities to create more public safety. But then you're sharing out those facilities with your CCA customer base to start out with. So it's a way of starting on public buildings. That way you develop a comfort zone, you develop specifications and protocols for microgrids and for this kind of development. You also develop all your local supply partners and pool of technologies that you're comfortable with and think are effective before you go into the neighborhoods and build resilience into the neighborhoods and use the CCA program to do that. The phase two is to engage the active members of the community in microgrids. And so the 3.0 program design includes support for cooperatives, and that's development support, enrolling support, and billing support. So basically, if you're in a building and you want a microgrid, you sign up for it, and the CCA will help make that happen. And then essentially enter into a memorandum of understanding with the municipality that your building is in to economically transact every month the payments for your participation in that microgrid. So functioning a bit like the blockchain systems that have been built in Brooklyn, the solar microgrids, but using the CCA instead with a simple administrative structure. And so here's just an image of the revenue streams, how that would work. That the CCA, which is providing monthly energy billing, which provide charges and credits to reflect the customer electing to participate in a local renewable facility. And then the municipality would administer the loan package for that system. And the customer then would receive from the CCA a bill charge based upon the payment made. So it's essentially an MOU between the municipality and the CCA so that the customer can elect to take a loan for a system and then pay it off based on the monthly bill with a net savings. So under this approach, the core suppliers for the CCA changed from today, where you basically just hire an administrator and then they go to an energy retailer and buy credits, or maybe build a single pilot system. But the main providers are going to be a renewable energy certificate trader, a wholesale generator that you never talk to, and someone on the grid that you also never talk to, unless you're a 2.0 program in California, to a very diversified program in which there are many different vendors, many of them local, providing the installations and maintenance of the systems instead. But looking at the microgrids, you're really going to end up focusing on the downtown areas in your towns, areas that have lots of people and lots of energy use, have high energy intensity and critical energy intensity to start development, and then you build out from those, multi-residential, commercial, municipal building areas, transit corridor areas, out into the neighborhoods from there. So it's sort of like a network design plan. And as far as the development process, there's the customer who's receiving CCA will opt to participate in shares, or opt with, we call opting with, to participate in a co-op. And so that will involve the CCA obviously informing them of that option. The CCA receives data as a result of being a CCA, and can therefore work with the municipality to arrange for that, for the customer to select among pre-qualified distributed energy resource developers to execute a project, and then will itself conduct the billing and repayment, as I said, under an MOU between the municipality and the CCA to make that happen. So you can see neither of them has to bear the whole burden. The customer's making the investment. The CCA agency or program or department is dealing with energy and planning, how that's going to how those new assets will be incorporated into the overall community supply. And the municipality itself is managing the relationship with each individual building dweller, each resident, each business, and is that organic relationship with the end user. So under this approach, all customers would be eligible for sharing. That's something that you've not seen before. Having low income, whether you're a renter, whether you have no credit score, whether you might be in public housing, be unemployed, you will be eligible. The CCA would approve cooperatives and then would work with the municipalities to manage those accounts. The municipality holding the loan accounts in the same way that they would handle PACE programs today, property assessed clean energy programs around the country. They would handle loan accounts with the customer, and the CCA would be processing the payments based upon the customers signing up voluntarily to participate in that loan. So it's a local organic business model, and that's the idea of an effective engagement, that there are no layers of separation between they're looking at their town the same as when they do recycling. They're not looking at some company that they've never heard of before, or some outsourced service provider. But the CCA is doing the rate charge collection. The municipality is handling the finance of the loan account. And the goal of the whole program is to help customers own their power, own their energy, broadly construed across all energy. But with a very simple rate structure, it's a meet or beat average default rate. So you're not going to be raising rates on people to pay for this. When they sign up to own or participate in ownership, they will be electing to pay a premium, which results in a bill offset. So just like when people who do own homes sign up for solar, they'll receive a forecasted return on investment based on their historical energy bill. They'll receive a similar forecast, and as a result, every single customer can get the kind of benefits that homeowners get when they buy solar for their rooftop. So this is the org chart, just looking at kind of the relationships, the CCA relating outwardly to regulators and to doing the traditional job of the CCA. That would be performed by staff, funded by the CCA. The municipality is relating to the CCA, but it's also relating to residents and businesses, and it's relating to the companies that are installing systems. And its programs would be paid for on an increment of the developed project. So all of its costs would be also covered. Here's sort of the division of roles, again, the CCA, energy facing, the municipality, customer and finance facing, and then customers acting either individually or inside of cooperatives. And this is just an org chart sort of expressing, how you have a CCA board voting on things, on policy. The bond council would be used if the CCA wanted to use green bonds for financing. Otherwise, you'd have a manager, a main manager, a CEO, who would be dealing with state compliance, regulatory compliance. Otherwise, would be a data-centered sort of redevelopment agency, really, which does customer service and then works with the data that it can collect as a CCA to manage projects across the town in the manner of a redevelopment agency. So I'll stop it there, and unfortunately it's 2 p.m., so you still have a little time left. I'll hand you back the mic here.
So this is great, Paul. Thank you for taking the time to run through this. There are any number of questions in the Q&A. I discovered that I was not able to write questions in the Q&A as a meeting facilitator. I don't have the ability to do that. So I would like to get to other questions. And also I just want to note, we've got till 3 o'clock. We scheduled this from 1 till 3. So I don't know what your schedule looks like, but we've got time to have conversation with you. And I'd like to kick it off with a very honest comment, which is that I love your enthusiasm for this, and I have a good deal of trust in your understanding of this in much more sophisticated ways than I have. But I have to say my head was swirling in what you just described.
Yep.
And my guess is that other people's heads are swirling too. Um, and for me, much as I appreciate and actually agree with a lot of your analysis of, the problems with outsourcing, I got to tell you that hearing this makes outsourcing in some ways seem appealing because they know what to do, whereas how in the heck do we, as relatively smaller communities coming together without super sophisticated understanding of all of this stuff, how would we gear up to do this? I just I'm kind of feeling lost and overwhelmed, and so I wonder if you can you know eh, take a little more time and explain how we would get off the starting block and learn this and grow this, and if you would envision yourself having a role in that. But it just feels overwhelming to me. It feels simultaneously exciting, but overwhelming.
Yeah, no, it is. It is overwhelming. I mean, that it's, and I certainly wouldn't want to say it isn't. I guess the only pushback would be, I think, the statement that outsourcing is appealing because they know what to do. They don't know what to do. And so it is overwhelming, but you shouldn't harbor the illusion that someone else is going to save you. They're not going to save you. And so it's overwhelming, but that's because climate change is overwhelming. And the need for change and the amount of change that's required right now is overwhelming. But that is an objective situation and not a result of CCA or 3.0 or anything else. The situation is that we need to change the entire basis of our, our local economy in rapid order. And so the only question at that point is, well, who's going to do that? And my main point is stepping back, and because a lot of the complexity is from the novelty, right? Things when they're new, they're complex, and they're complex too for that reason. The actual transformations we're talking about are happening, and they're happening in small towns as well as big towns. Some of the CCAs in California, in fact, are small towns. There's a number of them that are single small towns that are implementing CCAs. And Cambridge, Massachusetts is not a small town, but it's 100,000, I guess, right? And so they're a CCA and they're implementing it. In their case, the issue is that's why you need to have developed capacity inside of your town to do climate action, climate mobilization, because that's how you develop a familiarity and ease with these processes, and you normalize them within the local decision-making process. The same way that you have to, build a parking garage or a hospital. I mean, the first hospital probably looked really complicated too. The first water and sewer system is an incredible story. It took decades. In fact, it was in New York, Board of Health, right, that fought out over water and sewer systems. At the time, it was thought to be completely untenable to be building sewer systems, to have pipes across every single property, have pipes under your house and sticking into your house. And imagining all the problems that would be involved in that kind of process really did seem overwhelming. And there was a lot of opposition to building municipal sewer systems when they were first proposed, and because of the perceived complexity of doing so. Now, but who would say that, that sewer systems today are such a complicated thing? That it's not complex once they exist. It's complex to figure out how to do them. But the model here, it is what needs to be done is complex. But the model that we developed is in fact designed to be as simple as it can be, and to actually do it, right? So the 2.0 model created more complexity, but it actually did it. So the 2.0 model says, create a new public agency, and that agency is going to be responsible for buying its own power. And that means, like in San Francisco, I was very involved in setting up that program. And to launch that program, we had to get the mayor to put $20 million into a bank account. as escrow on the launch, because the CCA's there, they are buying their own power as wholesale entities. It goes straight to the power generator to negotiate terms, and they patch together their whole energy supply from 25 different power generators into one 8,760 hour schedule, and they cover the marginal risks on fluctuations in the forecasted load for their communities. They have to true up and correct it on a routine basis and make payments back to the utility. That's complicated, okay? That's really complicated. That's how we got the whole state of California to implement it. That's why it succeeded. Complexity was what made it happen. The simplicity of the outsourcing model that originates actually where I am now in Massachusetts was what made it not happen. So there are these sort of anti-intuitive facts, which I can't but point out, because it's very important to get this, that what is simple is often wrong. And complexity is often an opportunity. So within the energy industry thrives on complexity, right? That's what it does. It is in the complexity business, and which is, how do you provide, how do you make a solar plus storage system, work in relation to the grid and send signals through wireless network, or through, either through internet or through some kind of separate wireless system to control systems that operate in real time and send messages back and forth and ramp up and down batteries in relation to generators. And that's really complicated, but that's literally is the most fast growing, exciting part of the energy industry. Its complexity is what makes it grow. Because it's the opportunity, the economic opportunity lies in that complexity. So the approach here is very complex, but it is by being complex, it's opening up the game to not just to the energy retailers that you're going to be going to if you launch with an outsourced service, which will be Texas energy companies. That's what we're talking about. You're buying from Texas gas and oil companies. That's what you're doing. If you get then you go to someone else to buy the renewable energy certificates, who are essentially financial trading entities that trade certificates, and then they come to you and say, congratulations, you're 100% renewable. That is, the simplicity of the buyer resulted in a really horrible, fraudulent product. But if the buyer can organize more capacity and have more knowledge of what they're doing, and that's what you do by building a 2.0 kind of ability, then you can get all these new suppliers in the door that can innovate for you. They're not Texas oil and gas companies. They're not financial trading entities. They're technology companies. They're local developers. They're the real deal. They now can come and participate for your CCA because you've provided that opening by having know-how. You know how to bring them in. But if you don't know how, then you're stuck with, it's sort of like knowing how to cook. If you know how to cook, you can make a great meal. If you don't know how to cook, you got to go to the restaurant, and say, I want the burger, and so you get the burger. You get bad food. It's full of bad. It's unhealthy, right? If you want, you have to. So it's just that complexity is perceived as negative often by everyone, but it actually is the nature of the opportunity to do that. And so that's why I like to put it in front of you, knowing that it might make some people feel like, wow, that's so complicated, I'm going to do that. It's being done. I mean, this is happening. It's not like a utopian idea.
Yeah, and so what role in assisting, if we were to leap of faith and say, okay, we'll give this a try, at least nice guy, seems like he knows what he's talking about. If we took this leap of faith,
Yeah.
What kind of support are you able to provide for us to help us figure out how to move forward, build the capacity, figure out where to start, how to start? I mean, I didn't get any clarity of that. I mean, I got a picture of a really big vision that, again, I have a lot of trust in your understanding of this stuff to think there's probably real possibility here. But I don't see at all yet how I, as a town board member in a town of 3,300 people and 1,200 households, mostly rural, what do we do? You know, and even if we were to partner with the city of Ithaca and the town of Ithaca and, you know, others to become a larger aggregate, where do we start? What do we do? And probably most important, what kind of support do you provide for us if we wanted to think about doing it?
We would essentially act as a turnkey setup consultant. So we would be setting up your program. Our idea is really to start the program and then hand it over to the town. So we believe that consultants should be used to do new things and then go away. So to start out, you would depend on us to walk you through the decision-making process so you can make the decisions that need to be made and know what the consequences of the decisions are when you make them. And those would have to do with, you know, how you want the program to be run. And for, like I mentioned, you know, can we use your water and sewer bill? We want to use if you have water and sewer bill. Like in Cambridge, we talked about using their curbside recycling bill to do billing. So you need to set up the sort of administrative basis for engagement of the community through those existing services that you provide as a town. And it depends on what services you provide and what the conditions are and so on. So you have to work that out. The basic internal municipal use of your infrastructure to support the program. And that would define the contours of the program, right? Presence or absence of the ability to use that resource. Then we would be trying to get you to combine with your immediate neighbors to get larger. We would be looking then at developing the plan for these microgrids, where to put them. So looking at your municipal facilities and your municipal accounts and coming up with specific proposals to develop those facilities. And so those would go up first. The first action would be for the municipality to enter into essentially power purchase agreements for a microgrid or microgrids, depending on, you know, how big you are. And then we would set up the share system for the residents to sign up to own shares in the systems on your microgrids. And that would really launch the process. And it would be really after that amount of development occurred that we would launch the aggregation service with those options already baked into the service. So it would launch right away as a different kind of a program where people aren't just you know, buying grid power or participating in a pilot project, but it's, you know, community energy, and the opportunity is for them, whether they're homeowners or not, to participate in energy equity on those facilities. And then, so once that had launched, then we would shift into a more of a private sector development mode, trying to develop more local renewable resources that people can physically use. And as I mentioned, that would include heating systems, electric vehicles, as well as buildings. And then we'd have to do all the, you know, run all the procurement for that and set up the grid power part of that program, which is frankly the simplest part of the program. The hardest work of this approach is doing redevelopment, right? The easiest part is going out and negotiating power sales from some grid supplier. So that would be a fairly perfunctory part of the job. Obviously, we would also would help the city comply with the state Public Service Commission procedures. And so, but the goal would be, so essentially we would act as if we were you, but in the process, we would train staff. And then once an activity was established, we would sort of back out of the activity, versus an administrator who will just sit there for the next, 10 years collecting your money without necessarily doing much more. So our idea is to basically back out of the role once it's established, and so that you can focus your surpluses on developing the new activities within the program, and then once they're established, replace those with employees. So you gradually build up local employees that are running processes that we would set up, and eventually we would just go away, assuming that that it was finished, or that that there was sufficient capacity in the town to just run it, like what you have in California, where they have consultants to launch those programs. And they continue to have consultants on new initiatives, but other than that, they have employees that are providing those functions, and so you develop that capacity over time to grow.
Okay, great. Well, I don't want to, I could use up probably all of this hour asking you more questions, but we have many questions in the chat. So I'd like to go through and start actually with the last question that Chris Carrick had just posted, and then I'll back up to the others. But I think this question sort of follows on to some of the things I've been asking you. And Chris asks that he recognizes that starting with CCA 1.0, which is currently allowed in New York, with the idea of moving towards 3.0, runs the risk of inertia and locking into an inferior model. But on the other hand, wouldn't it also help to build public awareness and support over a circumscribed period of time, say 2 years?
Yeah, I do see the logic. Just it hasn't played out that way, and it's really because of energy democracy. The real issue is that public awareness occurs during formation of CCAs. The time that the public is aware is when the newspapers cover it, and the newspapers cover it when the CCA is formed. So our experience is, and this is a lot of experience now, this is not a little experience, this is 25 years of experience, 1,500 cities, 10% of the United States, and they all have followed the same pattern, which is however they launch, that's what they are. And the ideas that launch them define what they will be. Because the important thing to realize is that when you launch them right now, the people that are going to lead this and make it happen are members of the community, activists, intellectuals, citizens, then a few public officials who are unusually devoted to the subject. Fairly unusual people create CCAs. The people who replace them down the road when there's a new election or a new appointment, not so remarkable. As a rule, they tend to become much more bureaucratic, and they tend to just be what they are. So the time for change is now. When you launch the CCA, you have to achieve the change you're trying to achieve during the launch, and include that sort of DNA in the very fabric of the program, because whatever is not established during that period, it really is an energy democracy kind of process where there's an educational side to this, that consciousness of the public, the consciousness of the press, and the consciousness of elected officials sort of reflect each other or echo each other, and it becomes this dialectic of what we're doing. And that is fairly resilient and will carry a community forward over time and remain coherent, and it can become a guiding light and an inspiration. But if you say, oh, we're going to start with this little thing and do the big thing later, it just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen that way. It's like a phenomenological curiosity, that the way that we do democracy limits what we do to the moment that we do it. And every step forward is always so much harder. So we think, oh, let's do the easy thing now and the hard thing later. But that's what they're going to think later, particularly because they're not activists. They're not devoted to this cause. They're not militant. They're not super conscious about it. And the spotlight of the media, because the CCA program already exists, it's no longer on them, right? The public attention also is lost because a CCA 1.0 program doesn't compel public attention. It's boring, right? And so people don't come to the meetings, and the press doesn't cover what it does. And after a while, people form this image of what it is, and they say, oh, CCA is this. It's a way to get cheaper power. CCA is that. It's a way to get greener power. CCA is this other thing. It's a way to transform energy. It's a way to solve climate change. It's a way to allow poor people to own their power, right? These are the framework, foundational decisions that define the future of your CCA. And you really can't alter that direction. I've never seen it altered among all the CCAs I've ever worked with. I've never seen that. And almost every one of them thought they could do that, and none of them succeeded. So it was only the CCAs that formed with really clear sort of horizon, goal horizons or aspirational horizons that actually achieved them. I think you've got to find your comfort zone with a launch that doesn't involve cutting the baby in half, so to speak. And that's where the 3.0 model, and I would encourage you, we could continue the conversation, or I would encourage you to the other people on the call that haven't read it to read through it, because it really is trying to set up the ability to have this kind of, I know it sounds complex, but it's complex in order to not be risky. It sets up a much safer, actually easier way to do this than 2.0, but it is more complex. Complexity replaces risk. And so it's really a choice between those two things. And there isn't really another choice in my view. It's kind of a catch-22.
All right. Theodora, do you want to take over with the questions, or do you want me to keep reading them and you'll just answer, handle them? How should we do that?
It doesn't matter too much. I can take up reading them if you would like.
Sure.
All right, so I'm gonna start with some of the first questions that came in, so referencing the beginning of your presentation. So Chris Carrick asked, what does it mean to say that a CCA has built or owns distributed generation? What form of legal organization have the California CCAs that have done this taken, such as an LLC, 501c3, public corporation, or other? And can you describe their role and how they have capitalized on the federal ITC?
Well, they don't capitalize on the ITC if they own. If they want to avoid taxes, they can use green bonds. So we developed a green bond authority for San Francisco, which they have used. Most common way for a city to be an owner, CCA to be an owner, is for the municipality itself. That's where what we call the commercialization platform of the municipality itself as a government, owning, City Hall. We're very focused on City Hall, fire, police stations, City Hall complexes, and then other critical energy facilities in towns. Those could be schools, places where there's a lot of energy use, but also critical energy needs, which are publicly owned. Those facilities can enter into power purchase agreements long term, and they can arrange to either be or become owners of assets that are built in return for long-term agreements to take the power from them. There are many different ways to sort of skin the cat. Just on the ITC avoiding the investment tax credit. Again, that goes back to this tax avoidance problem, right? That we have a renewable energy industry that is built on tax avoidance. It's a somewhat remarkable fact, given that tax avoidance is a really big issue for our federal government, right? We don't have any revenues. It's going bankrupt. Well, part of the reason is that it itself has incentivized private investment in renewables by allowing corporations to avoid taxes by investing in renewables. And so it's a very regressive method of financing renewables that we have today in America. And that's where the green bond, I developed the green bond years ago as an alternative to ITC. It also makes those facilities independent of the Congress, right? The ITC changes, and a municipal tax exemption from green bonds can't change. So it's more stable source of tax-exempt financing. Then there's the third issue, which is that tax-exempt ITC-based finance projects notoriously result in absentee landlord renewables, in which case the participation in those systems tends to extract all the value of those systems from the community. So they not only sort of defund the federal government, they also defund the local economy. They're like little energy colonies that are quite harmful to everyone other than the owner of the asset itself. So I guess I look at it sort of the other way, that the ITC today is assumed to be the way to do everything. And I think it's parasitic. And for a climate solution, we need to turn the economics around and arrange for the economics to benefit the local community, to benefit the users of the energy, to become owned by the users of energy, and not the other way around, which is how we have it today.
So sort of in that same vein with regulatory issues, given the legal and regulatory limitations on CCAs here in New York, for example, communities have to go through third-party administrators who must in turn work with ESCOs rather than directly with the owners of community solar assets, and they cannot retain the revenue directly to invest in the asset themselves. What can be done today, and what changes are needed to the law and PSC regulations, and who is pushing for them?
There's the 3.0, in some ways, the 3.0 program was designed for New York based on the current laws. As I said before, the community distributed generation is designed for outsourced administrators, and it's not needed. It's not needed unless those outsourced administrators are being used. So there are no barriers in the state of New York to the 3.0 model today. It's as I said, I was on the CCA subgroup. We were specifically looking at barriers to state law. CDG came up in that subgroup, and it was something I made very clear to members of the subgroup, that CDG is simply there to provide outsourced administrators with a way of doing this. It's not necessary for the CCA to use that mechanism. It's simply for the administrator's convenience. And in some ways, it's one of these self-fulfilling prophecies that you create the perception that you can't do something because of the way that it's been set up. And the administrator wants you to think there's no other way to set it up other than through his business, perhaps. And so presents you with a false choice, that you either do it his way or there is no way to do it. And it's simply not true, that nothing prohibits the CCA from setting up this arrangement in which the investment that's taking place is a voluntary investment between the end user, who is a customer of the CCA, and the developer of that system. So that's the whole concept of 3.0. The reason I say it's so much less risky, even though it's more complex, because it turns the CCA into essentially a facilitator of a municipal activity focused on local residents. And these activities fall under the organic authorities under existing laws for municipalities, and not for any specific code or Public Service Commission authorization. It's a different arrangement which doesn't have this single pipeline of financial pipeline that CDG is using and that administrators are using. That pipeline is an artificial creation based on an old idea of CCA.
All right, and then working off of the comments that you just had, a question came in that said, there are already enough operating or authorized CCAs in New York to soak up all the community solar that has been built or is in the pipeline. This seems like another form of redlining that only those residents lucky enough to live in a CCA community will have access. How does the 3.0 model address this issue?
Mostly because it's not depending on tariff mechanisms to pay for things. Right now, as I said, that single pipeline model, which really comes from CCA 1.0, it's a very old model, means that all these community solar projects depend upon a PSC established funding source, and that's why it's limited. Otherwise, the other limiting factor I talked about in the slideshow was that the need to export energy is the other limiting factor, right? Caps on net metering is the other major limiting factor. So you have caps on all these programs that limit eligibility, but you have to reflect on what it is that's limiting the eligibility. If you're an aggregation and this is the 3.0 strategy, if you say, okay, we're just going to build solar systems on the site, we're going to use our relationship, our municipality's relationship with residents and businesses to enroll them in on-site generation assets or on block, in building, on-site or on block facilities that do not export onto the grid, and we're going to set those up to pay for themselves competitively, not based upon an established PSC tariff subsidy, basically, but on savings on the site from the facility. Then there's no cap on the systems. There's no cap on eligibility. There's no impact on the grid. There's no negative grid impact. So there's no way for the PSC or the utility to prevent you from building these systems. That's sort of the whole kind of core of the strategy, is that with this microgrid pathway, any town could basically go to 100% microgrid. In theory, nothing could stop you other than inability to enroll the customer. And so that's why we're focusing the whole CCA kind of business plan from, buying power and accessing subsidies, all this kind of stuff, to redevelopment, just redevelopment and customer relationship and finance. And if you shift that focus and you change the technology strategy and you change the sort of integration strategy, then all of these perceived barriers are gone. They disintegrate, disappear. They really are the creations of convenience that turn into a traffic jam of bureaucratic red tape.
And so, Paul, would public takeover of an investor-owned utility be a simpler and ultimately more effective method to mobilize for just climate strategy?
It's there have been times that I've recommended to communities like Boulder. I mentioned I work for Boulder, Colorado, and they hired me to tell them how to do CCA. And I came in and I looked at the legal situation and the utility, and I talked to the state regulators. I went to the legislature and came back and said, they're not going to let you do CCA. You should municipalize. So in that situation, yes. But in your situation, no. The main reason is that, well, for one, Boulder then went on to municipalize its utility. They're still in court today. They're not providing service. The utility is still providing service. That was 2010. So if you try to municipalize, you're talking about a 10 to 30 year litigation before you can provide service. It's really not an option for you, a realistic option. CCA is an immediate term option you can implement right now. You just have to get the community behind it, and you've got to get the decision makers to understand its importance. The main challenge is really just that, is people tend to have a sleepy attitude about energy stuff. On the other hand, they'll be really passionate about climate change. And if next time you have a hurricane, they'll be, extremely passionate about climate change. But so you need to connect those dots. You need to connect the urgency of climate change to how are we going to do our CCA program. If you don't connect the dots, then everyone's sort of stuck in this emotional envelope of boring energy stuff we have to do. And why are we doing this? It's so complicated, to, oh my God, how do we do this right now? And that's where Cambridge, Mass is at right now. They're at the oh my God moment. They're no longer complaining about how hard it's going to be. They want to do it now, yesterday. And and so it's like how, and the how question is complicated, but it's just that, it's complicated. But the complexity really is the opportunity. There's nothing stopping you from doing this right now. You really, what you think about, the real complexity is that talking to the brokers and talking to the administrators have convinced you that you can't do anything. And of course, that's the problem, is that when you hire a broker, that's exactly what they do to you. They persuade you that you can't do anything, and therefore you need them forever. And it doesn't, that's really the issue. Is it's a, if a town council or city council can connect CCA to the for climate mobilization, say this is climate mobilization, which is how we brand it, how we present it. This isn't just about electricity. It's an umbrella for all of your climate action, and you can set this umbrella up in a way that can transform the local energy sector categorically, systematically, and based upon internal capacity that you will control in your town. You need to get there to be able to think your way out of this. But until you get there, it just seems really complicated. Like looking in the sideways into a mechanic working on your car. You look at, God, I'm glad I'm not doing that. But there are a lot of people that know how to fix a car. And there are a lot of people that know how to install microgrids, and that know how to put in heat pumps, and know how to put in, wireless networks and SCADA systems and all the things that you need to do what I'm talking about. Lots of people. In fact, the industry is basically exploding. And so it's a magnificent time to try to do this, because you immediately have 20 geniuses at your door, and you've been accustomed to talking to middlemen and lawyers who tell you you can't do anything. You can do everything. That's the message I would like to leave to is, yes, it's complicated. It's complicated because you just saw it. But once you get into this game, you realize that it's just, there are a lot of layers. It's not rocket science. It's a layer cake.
And so I'm going to build on that and jump out of the list of questions that's there, because it sounded like, Paul, if I'm understanding a piece of what you talked about as one of the initial steps or building blocks is working with municipalities to reform their own buildings and to start there. It happens that the city of Ithaca, and I'm not sure, Rod, apologies to Rod Howe, who's on the call from the town of Ithaca, whether the town has also committed to a Green New Deal. And then I can also say that the county is also looking to reach net zero on their buildings, and looking at building new buildings, and doing quite a bit of work on existing facilities. Would this, how might that be, an opportune time for us to think about stepping in on this? And if so, how would we approach that?
I think it's the opportunity in a way. You've got because how you develop zero net. In fact, the work I'm doing for Cambridge is similar. They have zero net building goals, and they have carbon reduction goals. They have all these goals, resiliency goals. And so we're saying, okay, the CCA program is going to be the umbrella for all of these goals. And so, starting with the city buildings are one thing, but there's also the city fleets, right? There's vehicle fleets. Right. And then you have, in some towns, you also have ownership of the rights of way. Those rights of way are immensely valuable. You can put car chargers on them. Right, the sidewalks are actually quite important. And so some towns own their sidewalks. They own the rights of way. There's one town I've been dealing with where they have these old canals, and the canals, they're not using them, but the town owns the canals. And guess what you can do with a canal? You can cross it with a wire. And if you can cross a canal with a wire, then you can connect one microgrid to another, and there's nothing the utility can do to stop you. If you had to cross a road, they could stop you, because that's written into your franchise agreement. You can't cross the road. But it's not written, the canals aren't written in the franchise agreement. So there's this kind of stuff where you have to look at the actuals on the on your community. Like, what have you got? What's going on? What are the buildings you have? What are the accounts, the municipal accounts in those buildings? What are your fleets, your vehicle fleets? What is your procurement schedule on your fleets? Then what about the landfill? What's going out the landfill? Do you have like most towns, do you have a mountain of plastic right outside your town? Or do you have mountains of plastic going onto barges to Asia? A lot of US towns have, they're 100% renewable, but their plastic's all going to Southeast Asia right now. And so these are all resources and opportunities for you to reduce your carbon, and by integrating them, they can become resources. So problems can become resources. And that is really the kind of Aikido that you need on energy, is not to be in a box, but to become connective between the different energy activities and pollution activities that are going on in, between sectors, between the public sector and the private. And so when you look at going net zero in town buildings, you would want to set that up so that all those different activities would be connected. And there's a lot of implications to that between, so for example, vehicle to building technology, right, which is really coming out of the gate in a really big way right now and doesn't have that much press, but that's huge and massive. And so I would be very focused on vehicle to building because that's storage. You have flexible storage in public buildings based upon electric vehicle replacing your gas and diesel vehicles. Then you've got like I said, the landfill. The plastic in your landfill could be converted to hydrogen, at the landfill in a shipping container. Okay, so you have hydrogen, you could be getting rid of your plastic waste, which is a significant ecological impact, converting it to hydrogen, which could be used on your microgrids as an emergency fuel source. So we've been looking a lot into that. And it's the connective tissue between energy uses that create the opportunities. And if you're in a silo and saying, we just want to make our town hall net zero, you'll just end up with an oversized solar panel, and you end up doing nothing because you're just thinking power. And you shouldn't be thinking power. You should be thinking addressable carbon, right? Power, vehicles, heating systems, waste. And if you produce the connective tissue between them and you say, okay, we're going to figure out how these are going to connect. We're going to go to our departments and say, that are buying fleets, often the different departments buy their own vehicles and buy their own stuff, and say, we need you to align with us on this. We want you to get direction from the council to get everyone on the same board, so you're all buying through the same procurement mechanism to get electric vehicles. You're going to the landfills or the waste transfer stations, and you're talking to them about making post-consumer, unrecyclable post-consumer waste plastic available for hydrogen conversion, for example, or deciding not to do that. But you're not avoiding decisions, because what that does is it puts the staff in the city. This is the classic kind of dysfunctional family aspect of municipal government, which I've worked with for 30 years, that the staff aren't empowered to make decisions, and the council, the decision makers, are uninformed to make decisions. And so you have the uninformed and giving direction to the disempowered, and it's really dysfunctional. And so you've got to have basically overcome the silos that form inside of governments that prevent staff from being able to have that kind of purview and being able to cross departments and say, go to DPW and say, I need this and this and this, and go over to procurement, I need this and this, and then go to finance, I need this. You have to start connecting all the separate processes inside the city to make them more literate and capable. So you start integrating these processes, and then you put staff on it so they become a trustworthy connection point between those other staff. Again, you can see how an outsourced broker could not provide that role. They're always going to be arm's length. They're never going to have access to the internal data. They never have leverage to get any favors from other departments inside the city. They're not inside the city, right? You need someone inside the town or the city that has a hardwire connection to decision makers that can. And I've done a lot of this with like the Sonoma County CCA, which is probably the most progressive CCA in California. The way we got that to happen was just what I just said. We got all the departments that were really involved, from the transportation, county transportation officials, to DPW, to people that handle data, to finance, and from departments that were only tangentially connected to climate, to carbon. And we got them to meet once a week with us and gradually go through a process of agreeing that we're going to cooperate and share data. We got all the data, we collected all the data for a whole county, every government giving us all the data that they would not even give to each other. So we could get it all into one database and form a single model and strategy for what we were going to do. And so it really is about sort of reactivating the connective tissues within governments that have been siloed out, so that you can come up with that purview. Then you build a database, you start mapping it all out, you start mapping out the community, and then you start doing redevelopment based on that mapping system. And really the mapping system is a direct mail system, and it's an account management system. So you just build up this capacity to go out to people with some knowledge, instead of just offering a program and inviting people to sign up for solar, or this kind of so-called market-based approaches, which are really quite blind and super ineffective at engaging the community. Instead, you have a much more public-facing, internal, city family kind of connectedness that enables you to more effectively get people to do what they do when they separate their paper and their plastic, right? To actually cooperate, voluntarily cooperate.
Yeah. Okay. This may be our last question, just because we're approaching. It's 10 to 3 now.
Okay.
And this comes from another of the smaller municipalities here in Tompkins County. Joel Gagnon has asked, what's the smallest practical size of a municipality that could do this? Tompkins County collectively, nine different towns, and then villages within some of those towns. But collectively, we have 100,000 total residents in the county. So what would be the mechanism for implementing with multiple small municipalities of 3,500 to 5,500 residents?
I personally love that size. I think it's perfect.
Which, the 3,500 or the 100,000?
Well, the 100,000 is easy, right? The 3,500, it would be helpful to get a couple other towns at 3,500, so you get around 10,000.
Mm-hmm.
Launch, and it would be preferable that they be near you and not far away, but like semi-contiguous. You want to be an authentic community program. Part of the authenticity is that people can easily attend meetings and not become too big, and have an authentic democratic presence. But then, as far as like because there's economics of supply from the grid, and that's one threshold. And what generally the rule of thumb is, you need to be, have 50,000 people to get a good discount on system power, right? But if you're doing 3.0 or even 2.0, but you really can't do 2.0 in New York, 3.0 is what you can do in New York, then you're less focused on getting discounts from grid power. You're more focused on getting good proposals and projects for local renewables, right? So you're not looking to that your value proposition to your residents and businesses isn't, we're going to save you 5 or 10% on the rate you pay for energy, but instead we're going to help you become owners of your energy. And in that environment, a town of 3,000 is fine, because you're right, because solar installers, they will do one building at a time. And so it just comes down to what kind of buildings have you got? What's your energy use? Who's there? It's not so much, you don't need this mass volume because you're buying from big power plants here or there. And the traders that sell power to you, which are basically investment banks and trading entities that buy and sell power, they're financial entities. So as financial entities, they're the ones that want you to be 50,000 plus to give you a deal. But just single colleges and universities get deals. Single commercial businesses get deals on the market. So it really does vary. And I certainly would not discourage anyone based on size of a town from trying to do 3.0. I would probably discourage them from trying to do any conventional version of CCA under 50,000, because it is so much. The value proposition is delivered power discount. You know what I mean? That's the structure of the product. And if people are looking for that discount based on the rate, then they're going to expect that. Then that's where you want to be, 50,000 plus.
Yeah. Okay, great. So Paul, I'm gonna wrap us up.
Okay.
We do have a few more questions in the stack that there really wasn't time to get to. And so I wonder if we sent them to you in email, would you be willing to follow up
Yes.
on those? And then I also want to let folks know a couple of other things. One of which is that Paul will be giving another information session on CCA 3.0 to TICP at the end of the month. That'll be on October 30th from 9 to 11 p.m. And you can contact me or Peter Bardaglio if you're interested in attending that. We'll be sure to circulate information on that. And I presume, Paul, that you're willing to stay in touch with us as we think this through and have more questions?
Of course, yes. I'm
Good.
very happy to do this and anything you need.
Yeah, good. And the last thing I just want to let all of our participants know is that we will be planning a follow-up session for us to discuss internally. Follow up on this conversation with you, Paul, and figure out what other questions you have, what next steps we might want to pursue, and figure out that. So for those of you that attended today, I'm really excited at the attendance, and I'm happy to see that we had representation from the city of Ithaca and along with the town of Ithaca, which, by the way, Rod Howe did answer in the chat. For those of you that didn't see it, I was unsure. But Rod assures me that the town of Ithaca is also pursuing a Green New Deal, so hooray for that. And others of us, I think, from various outlying municipalities are also really interested in figuring out our best approach for this. So this has been, from my viewpoint, and I suspect, for many others as well, a very stimulating and interesting conversation. I do want to just bring up a couple of things that were more comments within the question and answer rather than questions. And this reflects back to some of the stuff that Paul talked about in terms of the ethics. And we had heard from another municipality that has signed up with an administrator, and that the administrator has been able to enroll them into a local community solar project. And Paul, I gather you were raising some ethical questions about that model. And one of the comments that was written, and I've heard similar comments to this one that was written in our chat, is that Chris Carrick spoke with a CDG developer the other day, community distributed generation developer, who said that CCAs are helpful and that subscribers can be gained efficiently, but they are also concerned that it doesn't provide the long-term revenue certainty because the CCA has to rebid every 2 to 3 years. In contrast, they get subscription contracts that auto renew every year, and so that is a part of, I think, Paul, some of the ethical questions that you raised about enrolling a whole CCA into a solar farm is whether, in the long run, whose interest that serves, and does it provide the certainty that the investors are looking for. Am I connecting those dots correctly, or?
Yeah, again, it's that single pipe issue because the business model they're following is all based on the CCA being the pipe and signing the agreement. It's not doing engagement in the community where members of the community would provide their own decision to invest, right? Voluntary investment. They're not doing that. Instead, they're using the government in a single pipe to commit a project. And then they're turning around saying, that CCAs don't give them what they want, not realizing that CCA has no limit on its ability to implement, and CDG is under extreme limits and is a pilot project. So it's just, there's no comparison, right? The issue is if you can use the municipality to engage a community, you have a far greater horizon of potential impact than you have using a single pipe on an outsourced company. And people have to develop literacy, I think, around what that means, because it has to do with which of these exits actually gets you outside the theater. One of them just puts you in the bathroom, and in my opinion, and it's not really useful. It's not. It does create a demonstration of concept, but the demonstration is capped, severely capped. It could never become a mainstream thing. It could never replicate. It could never become a big thing. It could only be a few that get out, just like net metering. A few, the end result of net metered solar is that, the early adopters got this, advantageous rate where they get paid to run the meter backwards. Well, that's capped at 5% all over the world. 5%. Yeah. That's capped at 5%. So I think you're limited to a 5% horizon. That's not climate action. You can't solve climate change inside of a 5% horizon. You need a 95% horizon to solve climate change. You need the entire other part of the pie that they're not letting you touch. And CCA can get you the 95%. But you've got to do real work that only municipal governments are really prepared to do, in the way that we process our waste and keep the water and sewer system working. And that's what it is. That's the real work that we're talking about, not just some contract that's signed by a broker with a third-party investor who has some Wall Street tax avoider paying for a project, which is what that is.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we are just out of time, so that was a nice note to end on. Okay. And I appreciate this very much.
Oh, I really thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk to you all, and hope it was helpful. And I will answer your questions, and would invite any further contact whenever you like. So thanks so much for having me on, Irene. Really appreciate it.
You bet. You bet. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Bye.